The essence of Circuit 6 is the experience of encountering what seem to be separate autonomous intelligences that aren't perceivable via regular sense perception. In other words, this means seeing and or hearing entities that others can't. Sometimes these experiences are called hallucinations. A hallucination is defined as an experience that seems sensory. It has an auditory or visual aspect to it, but the experience did not happen in the objective, external, physical world. When Circuit 6 is activated, these seemingly independent entities engage in some form of communication. This is certainly weird stuff, and we'll go through a lot of examples of these experiences. Robert Anton Wilson concluded that in order to properly understand and explore Circuit 6, one must put aside the question of whether these experiences are totally objective or real in any worldly sense. These experiences seem to be both inside of you and outside of you at the same time. This is the cover of a book by the controversial Dr. John C. Lilly, who I'll be discussing in detail later. For now, I want to mention his very appropriate name for these entities, intraterrestrial. As exotic as Circuit 6 sounds, there are probably several Circuit 6 experiences you can relate to. This silly meme speaks to a deep truth about our experience of being a human being. As much as we'd like to say, I thought this, or this was my idea, this simply isn't how thought works. Thoughts aren't ours. Thoughts occur to us. They happen to us. This is why so many of us experience intrusive, annoying, compulsive thinking. We experience constant mind chatter that's not fully in our control. I'd say the voice in our head is itself a form of Circuit 6 experience. It's just we don't recognize it as such because it's been accepted as part of our story of me. It's been normalized in status quo society. We all have a thinking process going on inside of us, providing us thoughts that we don't consciously ask for. This happens all the time. Dreams. What are they? No one is exactly sure, although there are plenty of scientific theories. I'm more interested in looking at dreams subjectively from our first-person experience. Dreams are something like immersive virtual reality experiences. These experiences seem to happen in a state of existence that is very different from waking life. When dreaming, we seem to step out of regular time and space, and we are transported into an experience that is not quite under our control. In dreams, we interact with entities, which are often representations of people that we know, and sometimes there are people that we've never met in waking life. These entities seem perfectly real during the experience. They operate like independent actors, often saying and doing unexpected things. From a personal, subjective point of view, you have to consider the fact that you most often have no conscious control over what is happening in the dream and what these entities are doing or saying. If you can't control them, can you really say they're just your imagination or just a part of you? Sigmund Freud and Jung, his close collaborator for many years, both pointed to dreams as being an extremely important form of communication. They can often provide the dreamer with a powerful symbolic message. Both of these founding fathers of modern psychology saw the dream as an essential entry point to understanding the human mind. Prophets, mystics, and religious seers from almost every religion and culture that we know of point to the importance of dreams. The Talmud, a central Jewish text, says that a dream uninterpreted is like a letter unopened. The Christian Bible references over a dozen dreams and visions. There's also the mythical Chinese Taoist sage, Zhuangzi, who had a dream of a very vivid experience of being a butterfly. After he awoke, he was never sure if he was a man dreaming he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was a man. Also related to dreaming is the subject of daydreams. I don't have much to say about daydreams except that I found they seem to also occur without conscious volition. Sometimes I'm in the middle of doing something or saying something and suddenly a memory or an imagined scenario arises in my awareness. I didn't ask for that, it just sort of happened. C.G. Jung would likely argue that these involuntary fantasies convey some deeper meaning if explored properly. As with many topics I'm covering in this talk, a well-researched lecture on dreams could be days long, so I'll move on. Hypnagogia is the experience of a transitional state between wakefulness and sleep. The opposite transitional state from sleep into wakefulness is officially called hypnopompia, but hypnagogia is regularly used in a general sense to apply to both, so that's the term that I'll use. Hypnagogia has been recognized as an important aspect of human experience for thousands of years. Early references to hypnagogia are to be found in writings of some Greek thinkers like Aristotle. In hypnagogic states, sights and sounds are experienced. They seem real yet ethereal. Some people listen to hypnagogic messages and visions for tidbits of wisdom. You can even Google techniques for hypnagogic problem solving. Personally speaking, hypnagogic states have played an important role in my life over the past 10 years. I can confidently say I wouldn't be giving this talk if it wasn't for the guidance, ideas, and visions that I have experienced in hypnagogic states. Parasomnia is a term for other kinds of phenomenon that happen between wakefulness and sleep, like sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is the experience of being awake but unable to move. It is as if the body is still asleep, but your conscious awareness is awake. During these transitions, you may be able to open your eyes, but unable to move or speak for a few seconds up to a few minutes. This can be a very unpleasant experience. Some people may feel pressure on their chest or feel like they're suffocating. Many people report seeing a demon or entity in the room with them during this experience. Sometimes the entity sits on their chest. Sometimes the experiencer notices an entity of the opposite sex attempting and sometimes succeeding to have sex with them as they're laying there paralyzed and helpless. So it's no surprise that a feeling of dread and intense fear is a common part of the sleep paralysis experience. This phenomenon has been documented for ages, as you can see in the 1781 painting The Nightmare. The word nightmare is derived from the Old English word mare, meaning mythological demon or goblin who torments others with frightening dreams. Sleep paralysis is very common, and there are now many self-deprecating memes. I've got some anecdotal encounters with sleep paralysis to share. One time I awoke opening my eyes and I realized that I was unable to move. I saw a dark shadow woman at my door holding a butcher knife. I felt intense fear and I couldn't move, but I told myself she was not actually there. It was just sleep paralysis. I had been going through a period of stress, and I'm glad I recognized what was happening before I panicked. Years later, a friend told me that she saw a man in her room. He was shooting blue energy from his hands, and it was aimed directly at her crotch. Then he flew out the window. She was not prone to such experiences, so it was understandably very concerning to her. Next are idiosyncratic perceptions. This is a term for perceptual experiences in waking life that seem to have no objective reality. These experiences are commonly had by people with no underlying evidence of pathology. In other words, healthy people have them very often. Way more people have idiosyncratic perceptions than have serious mental disorders. As common as idiosyncratic perceptions are, there is actually no scientific consensus on what they are. There are many inconclusive theories. Paracousia is a form of hallucination that involves perceiving sounds without any external auditory stimulus. British journalist John Ronson did a BBC Radio 4 piece many years ago on the subject of people hearing voices. He and several others admitted to hearing voices in their youth. Listening to this actually reminded me that when I was a child, I often heard entire group conversations, especially when I was concentrating on a task like a household chore or doing homework. As I grew older, this went away and I forgot about it. Apparently, this is what happens to many people. In the UK, there's an organization called the Voice Collective. They claim that research indicates 1 in 5 young people under the age of 13 and 1 in 12 of older teens have had experiences of hearing voices or seeing things that are not there physically. And again, this goes away most of the time as they get older. There is the well-known phenomenon of children having imaginary friends or conversing with people that no one else can see. Other common forms of auditory hallucinations are those that happen in combat situations. High-altitude climbers also experience them, and so do those in solitary confinement. Apparently, if you're suffering from severe sleep deprivation, hallucinations in general are pretty much guaranteed. And this experience is considered less concerning than it was in previous decades. It is now at least slightly better understood that the mere presence of a hallucination does not predict mental health deterioration. Think of a hallucination as if it were like a cough. A cough could just be a cough, or it could be indicative of a disease. So similarly, a hallucination is an experience that may or may not be linked to a disease. Even if you haven't had the experience of a hallucination, you may relate to the experience of having an earworm. Not a literal worm in your ear, I'm referring to songs that get stuck in your head. Having a song stuck in one's head isn't considered mental illness. What's fascinating to me is the autonomy of hallucinatory activity. These voices or visual entities often have a personality. They seem to have their own agency, similar to the entities we encounter in dreams. But if hallucinatory intrusion becomes intrusive in one's waking life, this certainly can be a symptom of mental illness. Immersive hallucinations occur frequently in psychiatric conditions such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic disorder, and borderline personality disorder, as well as other illnesses like dementia and Parkinson's. I'm about to share some interesting stories of people and their mental illness-induced hallucinations. But while these are interesting stories, mental illness should not be romanticized. The experience of mental illness can cause great distress and psychological harm, as well as possibly lead to physical harm for oneself and others. This section is not in any way meant to minimize that. The photo with the man with the scarf there is the Nobel Prize-winning mathematician John Nash, who was depicted in the movie A Beautiful Mind. His real story was complicated and less hopeful than the movie version was, but it is true that he never fully overcame his hallucinations, but rather continued his work despite him hearing voices and having his peace of mind constantly intruded by paranoid thoughts. Daniel Paul Schreiber was a German judge in the 1800s who famously was diagnosed with mental illness. He was hearing messages from God. He thought God would transform him into a woman so that, as God's partner, he could give birth to a new race of humanity. They were little men who lived on Schreiber's eyelids. He had visions of many heavenly and underworld realms. In 1900, Schreiber lost the legal right to manage his own life. He lost control of his financial affairs, and he lost the ability to check out of an asylum. Since Schreiber was a lawyer and judge, he knew that his best hope of freedom was a legal challenge to the order placing him under state control. He wrote a book called Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, an influential book in the history of psychiatry and psychoanalysis. Memoirs of My Nervous Illness was meant to be a foundation to his legal appeal. He argued that despite his hallucinations, his intellect was not clouded. Schreiber wrote in a rational, academic, and legal prose, specifically to demonstrate his clarity of thought. And Schreiber was successful in demonstrating his ability to think rationally, so the legal order placing him in the asylum was rescinded. He gained control of his life again. Schreiber continued to have problems in his life, and he never disavowed his visions or experiences. He simply proved that he could manage aspects of his life rationally, regardless of what he was going through. So looking at this case through an 8th Circuit yoga lens, I view Schreiber as a man who had a dysfunctional relationship with Circuit 6 activation, but he still had a highly functioning and well-educated rationalistic Circuit 3 working very well. Journalist John Ronson interviewed a man who was hospitalized on the verge of death. Over the course of several days, this man interacted with another patient in his hospital ward. This was an African man. When the patient recovered from his illness, he learned that the African man never actually existed. The patient had hallucinated every interaction with the African man. Ronson interviewed a woman who began hearing a voice when she joined college. This voice would narrate her activities as she went about her day. When medical professionals expressed concern about this voice, they placed her in an institution for treatment. Then the voice became harsh and negative. It multiplied into various voices. After years of traditional treatment and the worsening of her condition, she thought she'd never live a normal life again. Then she joined a program that took a different approach to treatment. This program taught her to make peace with her voices. At the time of the interview, the voices had become friendly and helpful. She stated that even after her difficult journey, she would not want to get rid of them. It's commonly understood that hallucinatory voices tend to be nastier in Western countries due to the experiencer's resistance to them. Beloved and influential mythologist Joseph Campbell told the story of a Native American tribe and how they handled the powerful schizophrenic visions of a young man in the tribe. The tribe acted out the schizophrenic's vision out of respect and to appease nature. This act apparently facilitated the young man's healing. Sometimes a Circuit 6 experience is subtle. It's not always as obvious as hearing a voice or seeing someone who isn't physically there. Many traditions speak of seeing an inner light or hearing musical pieces or seeing quick flashes of mental imagery. And going back to the theme of higher circuit art, Circuit 5 art is clearly inspired by the heart and inspires the heart. When Circuit 6 is activated, the experiencer gets the sense that the inspiration for the art comes from somewhere else. It flows through you, but it's not quite yours. This experience of channeling art and music is well known among creatives. The Beatles' Yesterday is arguably the greatest pop song of all time by several standards. Its legacy is cemented in music history. This song famously came to Paul McCartney in Hypnagogia. He says he woke up one day and just heard the song playing in his head. He got out of bed, went over to the piano, and transcribed it. Another beloved Beatles song, Let It Be, was also a Circuit 6 inspiration. McCartney's deceased mother visited him in a dream and gave him advice. He refers to her as Mother Mary in the song. Before I got into any of this subject matter, I experienced this sort of Circuit 6 activation myself, and I found it really bizarre how the content just flowed through me. It felt like I had tapped into a stream of information. It was really surprising. This is how the eBook I wrote came about, and I'm sure some of you listening could relate to this. The Muse is a well-known female characterization of this artistic inspiration. The Muse is a representation of a Circuit 6 activation. She'll actually play a larger role in this talk as we move from Circuit 6 to Circuit 7. Here's Homer conflicted, trying to decide between his inner angel and inner devil. I'm sure we've all seen some variation of this concept before. It's a very common and old motif. The early Christian book, The Shepherd of Hermas, thought to be written around AD 140 or 150, has a reference to the idea of two angels. There are angels within man, one of righteousness and the other of inequity. Perhaps you've had experiences hearing your conscious or your intuition telling you something. I would say this is a Circuit 6 phenomenon. Circuit 6 is the source of what we typically would call women's intuition. Here again we find the recurring theme of wisdom and inspiration being feminine in nature. A few years ago, I took a class led by Raymond Moody and Lisa Smart. Moody was a medical doctor as well as a philosophy professor. He is well known for his work as a pioneer in the field of near-death experiences. And Smart, in many ways, is continuing his work. They speak of the deathbed experiences of dying individuals. These include deathbed visions, often involving loved ones or ethereal otherworldly beings. It isn't rare to hear that deceased family members or deceased friends have arrived to encourage a dying person to let go of this world and move on towards something else. Sometimes the dying take well to these visitors, other times they are resistant. Sometimes they start off resistant and then eventually let go. Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust and author of the famous book Man's Quest for Meaning, told the story of a dying woman. He was attending to her, and she said she was having a conversation with a tree outside the window. The tree told her, quote, I am here, I am here, I am eternal life, end quote. Psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is best known for her work with the dying and introducing the 5 stages of grief to the world. Lesser known, I think, is that she became very bitter at the end of her life, saying the work she had done for 40 years was a waste. But one thing she never took back was a firm belief that the dying came in contact with deathbed visitors from another realm, and she herself felt she was in communication with her patients after their deaths. She called them her spooks. Deathbed experiences were apparently considered very common before heavy sedation was introduced in the 20th century. In our class, Moody shared that the ancient Greeks wrote about the phenomenon of the swan song, or a final performance. This is a phrase we use to this day. A dying person would sometimes break into poetry or song right before death. In Japan, you have a tradition of death poem, a farewell poem written by a dying person. Dr. Moody says that he's been personally told of cases where a dying person had zero interest in poetry or song, but nevertheless recited poetry or sang on their deathbed. Smart provided those of us in the class with a copy of her book, Words at the Threshold, which shares a few anecdotal stories where families report that a dying loved one said startling or unique things before dying. Deathbed sayings are sometimes irrational and nonsensical, sometimes uncharacteristic, sometimes they contain deep meaning, and sometimes it's a mixture of all those things. These all sound like examples of Circuit 6 to me,